This week on Two Legs,
We have Dr. Kenneth Womack.
and it's the 80s collaboration between George Martin and Paul McCartney.
Join me this week, folks, on Two Legs, your go-to Paul McCartney podcast.
Stay tuned. Hi, McCartney fans, and welcome to another edition of Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast. And if you are new to the show, we are a Paul McCartney talk show mainly dealing with Paul McCartney's solo career. I'm one of your two co-hosts, Tom Hunyadi, and as always, I am joined by my partner in crime, my backwards traveler, the one and only Andy Nichols. Andy, what's going on, my friend?
Not much, Tom. Good to see you again tonight. Just getting ready for a good show and a good topic, talking about Paul and George Martin in the 80s.
Yes. Oh, look at that. VHS, huh? You know, I was scrolling eBay and someone did have the laser disc for sale, and I almost purchased it. Who knows? Maybe I still will, but we'll see.
Go for it. But I'm doing well. Thanks for having us on again tonight, Tom.
Yeah, no problem. And we've got a special guest. Like Andy said, we're going to be talking about George Martin and Paul McCartney's work together in the 80s. Our guest today is one of the most respected authors writing about the Beatles today. His books include Solid State, Abbey Road, and The End of the Beatles. We also have this behemoth. It's the Beatles Encyclopedia, and of course his two-part George Martin biography, Mexican volume, and sound pictures, which will be the main topic today. This second book, it features from age 40 to his death, I believe, and his other books also include The Beatles in Context and the upcoming John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in the Life, which we're all looking forward to, and maybe Ken can say a few words about that later on in the show. You also have another one of his books in your hand there, Andy?
Yeah, Cambridge Companion to the Beatles, which Ken edited and expertly, and there's a great collection of essays from academics all over the world, and that's highly recommended as well.
Cool. And when he's not traveling around the world researching and writing about the Beatles, he's joining me, Kit O'Toole, Ken Michaels, and Joe Mayo on Talk More Talk. And we are both pleased to have Dr. Kenneth Womack back on the show. Ken, hello, and thank you for coming back.
It's great to see you guys again. And of course, talking about Paul McCartney is a welcome tonic during these COVID days.
Right. Well, as we said, we're gonna be discussing part of your book here, Sound Pictures. But first, we're going to discuss a few items that just popped up the last couple of days. What's the date today? We're recording on the 16th here, April.
16th.
Yeah, April 16th. Yesterday, Howard Stern Paul McCartney called the Howard Stern Show and talked for about 45 minutes. Not really much in the solo end, more or less just talking about John's writing about how do you sleep, and Paul had his usual answer to that. He really didn't.
He did spoke a lot about the film, the upcoming film.
Yes, he talked a lot about the upcoming film, about how a lot of us are going to enjoy it. And just like everything else, we probably don't know when it's going to, he probably doesn't know when it's going to come out now because of what we're dealing with these days. So he's really excited. He sounds really excited about it, actually. And, that gets me excited for the project as well. And we're going to get back to the Get Back thing here in a second. Also, today on Paul McCartney's YouTube channel, they discussed that they're going to be releasing a video for the "Maybe I'm Amazed" song. And also, there's going to be a listening party on Spotify to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the McCartney album. Andy, do you use Spotify at all?
I don't. I use Apple Music.
Okay. Ken, do you use Spotify?
I am with Apple Music too. Andy and I are particular about that.
Great. But getting back to Get Back, Ken, we a lot of our guests that we've been having on the show lately, I've been getting their thoughts about this Get Back project and what they would like to see happen for the release. What are you looking forward to this project? What would you like to see on the finished release?
Well, if whenever we have a new project like this, I like to see new images I haven't seen. So if they have footage we haven't seen before, I welcome it. Mm-hmm. Certainly if there are, any remastered recordings from the sessions, particularly the material that has never been released officially, although we probably heard it, in bootleg fashion, I welcome that as well. I would love to see a wonderful full-length version, warts and all, of the rooftop concert. We don't really have that. Probably like me, you have a few recordings of it from the various machines in operation that day, but I'm ready for something that is, done by pros. Right. I'd love to see the entire rooftop concert in the kind of beautiful living color that we saw at the end of the anthology, that sort of thing. So I certainly welcome that. I have a feeling that Peter Jackson will do something memorable. I probably slightly in the minority, although I liked the Ron Howard film at first. It has really not aged well for me, in the sense that there's a lot of kind of rehistoricizing that takes place. So I hope that we don't see any of that with this project. I've seen a number of prominent voices saying things about how, well, it'll have you rethink everything, and I don't think we need to rethink that period. I think it's one of the best moments in the Beatles' career, especially given the late date of it. Here they are having this miserable month by their own admission, right? Just a terrible time, hating on each other. One guy quits the band. And yet, because they're so talented and so extraordinary, they pull rabbits out of the hat for the end of the month, and they produce, half a dozen classic songs and several really good ones. They have the rooftop concert. Billy Preston makes his mark. There are just some magnificent moments there at the end, and that to me is the great story. And it's the classic baseball metaphor, right? Pulling victory out of the jaws of defeat. And that's what makes that project so exciting, at least for me. And of course, it sets up, although they quickly wreck it, it sets up, tees up Abbey Road very, very well.
Yeah. On a similar note, Ken, about that period there, there's been a lot in Paul's interview. I know what you said you didn't hear yesterday. He kind of gloated about how great making the film was, and everything was great. And to that extent, Giles Martin has said a lot of that when the White Album came out in 2018. Do you feel there is some kind of attempt to do a little bit revisionist history regarding the end of the Beatles, or is it just, it is what it is? I mean, I get the feeling there's a little bit of that now, 50 years later now. It seems like we're kind of just throwing roses at everything now. But maybe, time heals all wounds. I don't know. What do you think?
They're just not the best sources on this. Paul and Giles, they're, especially now, first of all, Giles, is only a couple of years younger than I am. He has no memories from that period. Paul has obviously had many, many experiences since then. I just don't think that's good testimony, really, about the quality of the experience. The best testimony is what we have from those days, actual descriptions from people, including the principals, John Lennon especially, about what was happening, and that's okay. I think, probably the problem that folks like Paul, to my mind, that Paul and Giles have, is that they've never taken a sort of an academic or a scholarly look at their work. So I do it often every fall in a Beatles course. And what's fascinating about it is when you look at them under that kind of microscope, and you go from Love Me Do until the end, right? And when you have that experience, you realize that it's the warts too that make the story great. Yeah. It's terrible that Brian dies when he does, but it sets up, these moments where these fairly young guys have to wrest, success out of terrible circumstances. And they do it over and over again, and that makes it exciting. It's George Harrison banging on his chest during the Let It Be, the I Get Back sessions, and saying, heart of hearts, I should be here with you guys.
Right.
Even though they were pissing him off. And even though he had just about had it with being treated by everyone, including George Martin, like this second-class citizen, he recognized that what they were doing was important enough that it was worth his time at that moment. Yeah. I mean, that's what great literature, that's what great art is. It's about seeing something that's bigger than yourself. And they were able to do that, frankly, better and more often than most artistic fusions. And, folks like Giles and Paul they're just selling product to us. Yeah, and we're going to buy it, and that's fine. And Giles makes no pretensions. I mean, I've seen him up close and personal during these kinds of events where they'll come out with a new product, and he doesn't pretend to be an historian or anyone with that kind of background. He looks to others for the details.
Right. Was it unfortunate that we got the Let It Be movie with all the warts, like you say, instead of what we heard on the bootlegs, which they are having a lot of fun on those bootleg recordings, and I'm assuming that's what a lot of that is what we're going to hear and see with this Peter Jackson release.
I guess, they're certainly having fun when they get their business together in the latter half of the month when they're at Apple Studios,
right?
Because they're functional again, right? And George Harrison was correct in his gambit on why it was useful to bring in Billy Preston and change the context so that everybody would behave. And suddenly George Martin felt welcome again, and there was a better vibe when they did that. So it did make a difference, but let's not recast the history, and let's instead elevate the triumph. And the triumph is, even in those terrible circumstances of their own making, by the way, when one member of the band has a raging drug addiction, another is realizing his value outside of the group. Paul, of course, is clinging to, as you guys well know, is clinging to the greatest creative experience he's ever going to have, and he knows how worthy it is and how desperate he is to maintain it. Those are fantastic plot setups for any great story, and that's what makes the Beatles story great. And I say this to my students, you have this band that it creates 6 or 7 easy masterpiece records, right? Masterworks, undeniable. And yet their manager dies. Another guy is murdered. Another guy dies young, George Harrison. All of these, they nearly get back together. They can't quite make it work. That is just a great human story.
It is. The greatest 20th century romance, as Derek Taylor said.
Yeah, and it's already the thing that mattered. We owe John Lennon so much because he was asked the question, and he was doing that interview blitz toward the end of his life. He had his answer down pat. Why are you worried so much about us getting back together? The records are what matter. He would always point people back to the music.
Yeah. That's what we still have. So
yeah.
Yeah. Is it important that to you? I mean, it's important to me, but it's important to you that we also get that original Let It Be movie as is to coincide with this release.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. That's the movie that John Lennon was watching with Jan Wenner and their wives. Remember,
Mm-hmm.
right after it came out, with tears streaming down John's face, feeling the emotional power of it. Hell
Right.
yeah, we
Yeah.
need that. In
Cool.
fact, we need that more than anything else they're going to give us this fall. No, I mean, we need that. We have
Yeah.
Yellow Submarine. We have the other movies. We
Right.
need that. And that is part of their legacy.
Yeah.
Brings a lot of closure. I think it brings a lot of closure to the whole period too. This has been a film that's been, been kicking around for 20 years of maybe it's coming out, maybe it's not. And I think it'll bring a lot of people and fans closure with this getting a true commercial release. I know it came out on VHS at some point, but it's been buried and hasn't been available. It'll really provide a lot of closure, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah. And, and what we'll be seeing, my understanding now is that there will be a soundtrack of some sorts that accompanies it. Because we already have Let It Be Naked, which is brilliantly, cast, except for a couple of minor mistakes, like leaving off the coda for Get Back. But, beyond that, I believe we will have some kind of soundtrack that accompanies the Peter Jackson film.
Right.
And hopefully, well, if they're smart, they could be selling us the full rooftop concert uninterrupted, both in sound and in vision.
Right. Yep. Cool. Yeah. Really looking forward to this release. However, now when it gets released, it's still up in the air.
I was scheduled for early October, but now who knows, right? Yeah.
Who knows? Yeah. I still wouldn't mind. I wouldn't be surprised if they give us a home release through Netflix or Disney. I think Disney, so it would probably maybe Disney Plus would show it if it doesn't make the theatrical circuit in October. So maybe we still will get it on time, but just in a home release and not a exactly. So okay, so tonight's topic: George Martin, Paul McCartney, take two or three, if you will, if you want to include Live and Let Die. But I know a lot of our fans, we know Paul McCartney's history leading up to George Martin and Paul's work together. But Ken, if you can you kind of just give us like the last couple years of George Martin leading up to that question? Paul asked George Martin after dinner one night in October 1980, what was he working on? Was he successful at the time? Just give us like a brief little history on that.
Yeah, are we talking about Paul or George?
George Martin. George Martin. Yeah.
Well, George's activities had been absolutely consumed with Montserrat and bringing that studio to fruition. Just absolutely consumed with it. It was dominating his time. It was an enormous multi-million-dollar expense.
Right.
It paid off handsomely, of course, because it's hard to imagine a studio in the 1980s that produced more revenue than Montserrat. I mean, it was the go-to place for, I totaled it up one point because I was just interested in a kind of raw figure, more than $1 billion worth of sales. Everybody who was anybody was working there. And I guess arguably the last blockbuster Stones album was made there. Police went there. You had just Clapton, others were there regularly, making a mint out of being able to use those sort of Pacific, even though it's Atlantic, surroundings. The quietude, being able to focus. You've probably read all of Keith Richards' jokes over the years about, drug dealers not there. You don't have friends coming in from out of town. You just work on your record. So George had been leading up to that for 2 or 3 years. It has weird parallels with the Let It Be Get Back project, in the sense that for a while he was considering buying an ocean liner. you know, and having a kind of floating studio. I don't know if I think it actually predated the notion Paul had and the London Town project with the dots. But in any event, George was simply dominated by that project and was feeling the intense pressure because a lot of upfront money had to be used to bring that project in. I know folks who saw him in the city up here in New York at the time, and they were pretty. They remember George being very tense because he was on the bubble. He had also just come off of a failure that he could see coming from a mile away. He was paid very handsomely. It had been his biggest payday in the history of his career. And that was the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band project, what came out in 1978. Right. He had worked on that for a couple of years. In fact, he moved his family to LA for a while, where they did all of the recording and the post-production work on the film and on the soundtrack. And he had his old pal Jeff Emmerich working with him. And even while they were bringing that project in, they could tell that it just wasn't, it wasn't cutting it. In fact, one of his assistants was working with him at the time, and George brought him in before they added in the vocals because he was so proud of the quality. And, reading between the lines, I think we could figure out that George knew that once you started adding in those voices, it was going to get cheesy pretty fast. And it did, right? And it did. I mean, that album was shipped back, as they like to say, double platinum.
Yeah.
My copy, I don't know where it's back in storage somewhere, but it was one of those cutouts, right? That had the, the hole at the top. Even that, I couldn't buy it fast enough not to get the return. And of course, dutifully never really played it, right? Because, it paled so dramatically against the backdrop of the real thing. It is not even better than the real thing. So George had a lot to prove at that time, and he felt acutely the pressure of what he needed to do with the studio. His work with America, which had really brought him a lot of joy. They were on the wane by the late 70s, no fault of George's. Their material just wasn't as good. He really only worked with one band that could produce over and over again in terms of great material, and it wasn't America. But he had put a lot of energy and love into them. And in fact, as you guys know, shortly after, around this period, they would go off with another producer with his blessing and be successful. They would have their last hit with "You Can Do Magic."
Magic, right?
Sadly, is now stuck in all of our heads. It is no Ventura Highway.
No, it's not.
No.
But anyway, so that's kind of the scene that George is in at the time. He's had a great 1980s. Of course, less than a year before he meets up with Paul to have that conversation that you just referenced. He sees John Lennon for the last time at the Dakota.
Oh, he does? Okay.
Yeah, December 1979.
Okay.
And has mixed feelings. For one thing, John apologized for being, kind of a jerk in a couple of interviews. And George was very angry about that because he took stewarding their legacy very seriously and often was not paid well for it. Which George also kept track of, as you guys know. But anyway, in that meeting at the Dakota, John kind of threw him for a loop when he started talking about how he would like to redo everything they'd ever recorded, especially Strawberry Fields Forever. And it took George Martin a long time to think that through. Finally sort of found solace for himself when he realized that that's just John Lennon, right? This guy who, I think I'm going to paraphrase, but he said something along the lines of, life can never be as good as John imagines it. That what's going on inside of his head is always going to be better than what's produced in the studio. And of course, We also have to realize this in the context of John Lennon at that moment was very worried about all this new material he'd been silently, quietly accruing for the last few years. By then, he's already written "Watching the Wheels," and he must know at some level that it's a great song, but he's very nervous about making his return. So, in fact, by the time Paul and George are talking later in the fall, John has already recorded about 25 songs.
Wow. Yeah. Crazy. And then he's also working with Cheap Trick, and he's not producing a lot of people at the time though. Throughout the '70s, he picked the artists that he worked with carefully, right?
He did, although he made pitches, as you know, to a number of acts. He wanted very badly to work with Hall & Oates, and they turned him down, and they felt like idiots later. Although obviously they made bank, but he turned down the opportunity to work with David Bowie. I would like to have heard that.
Oh, absolutely.
After Bowie, this is after Bowie's Heroes period when he's sort of plotting what's next. Okay. Although no one could ever take away what he would do with Tony Visconti and all of his great work together. But he was having some issues trying to make the next selection on what he was going to do. I'm glad you brought up Cheap Trick because while the album didn't perform in the way that they all thought it would, particularly given the kind of trajectory of success Cheap Trick had been on, and maybe it just didn't have the right hit single in its contents. Although I like Stop This Game very much and World's Greatest Lover, which George Martin adored that song. But I really thought that was one of their best recorded projects. It's just so well done.
Right.
And they're clearly having a good time, including George, who makes his vocal cameo on it.
Yeah, Cheap Trick is a band that I still need to check out. I think growing up, listening to I Want You to Want Me over and over again on the radio just kind of like pushed me away from Cheap Trick. So maybe one of these days I'll finally venture out and listen to some of their material. I know the hits obviously, but I'm a deep cut guy. I love discovering deep cuts of bands. So I'll definitely check them out one day. And
well, let me give you your assignment for tonight, Thomas.
All right, please do.
Okay, so your assignment is to with your best pair of headphones,
yes,
listen to the song Voices from Dream Police.
Dream Police, done.
And let it wash over you. It is a highly Beatlesque song for one thing, but it's just a beautiful recording.
Will do. Gotcha. So coming up now onto this dinner in October of 1980, Paul, George, you wrote that George had seen more of Paul and Linda throughout the 70s than the others. And you wrote that he was surprised by Paul asking him to produce him again. Why do you think this is? I don't know I know Paul has established himself as a great producer, but I would have think that George would have taken that as a compliment to produce Paul again, don't you think?
Well, I think he did take it that way, but I can't know this, and I haven't seen any evidence because she simply was too polite to leave any behind. I'm talking about Linda McCartney, who always felt like, and she would include herself, by the way, in the few remarks she made, that she felt like Paul was playing with lesser musicians.
Right.
And she made this clear, especially, you've probably seen the same interviews I have, when he goes back on tour in '89. And she's like, finally, these are better guys. And he would even find better guys still, I would argue, in the current band, people who are just virtuosic. And that's just really true. And she felt like Paul was carrying them. And I have a feeling at some level she may have spoken, frankly, to George. I can't prove it. But knowing how she would occasionally let those kinds of glimpses appear, I wonder if she's part of that. Why would Paul need a producer? He's now produced several #1 records. He's a multi-platinum artist. outside of Elton John, there's nobody else who's more successful in the 70s.
Right.
Right. And legend has it, right, that he was being brought in to produce the next Wings album, right? Wasn't that was supposed to be the
Well, that was the idea. And if you ask folks like Lawrence Juber, they'll say that George Martin kind of spelled the end for them.
Right.
Yeah. And George saw himself as sort of giving Paul a kind of cover to be able to move on from Wings. Although he's already started that process, right? I mean, the release of Mark McCartney 2, that hoists up a pretty loud flag. And if it weren't for the live version being such a runaway hit in the United States of Coming Up, Wings wouldn't have had a gasp in 1980.
Right.
And of course, Paul probably felt very badly, understandably, about how they ended in Japan. So George is mixed up in there somewhere with the demise of Wings. What he probably didn't realize, and I think you can only see this when you look at the great depth of their collaboration, is that Paul needed him for other things. Paul needed someone who could say to him, hey, Rain Clouds shouldn't be on Tug of War.
Well, yeah, and then now getting to that
right?
point,
that's a big thing.
Yeah, right. So George, agreed to produce him, but he made the one single demand for Paul. And, if we're going to work together, you got to accept what I have to say as being valid, and I think that was, brave of George to say. And I think it was probably the right thing for him to say because, Paul was just, so used to having yes men around him for so long.
Yeah,
absolutely. And for the most part, at least early on, it looks like George was very successful at doing that, and his success in helping Paul throughout the 70s and in various moments is obvious. The work he did on Ram, quietly, Let It Die, I mean, he brought the goods when he did work with Paul. And to my mind, I don't know about you guys, I think Tug of War is Paul's best recording through of his career.
It's definitely my top 5 for sure.
And I'm counting Wings when I say that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's all under one umbrella. Yeah,
right. I think it's way up there.
But the work he was starting on, I mean, the first, I think it was like 4 or 5 songs. You got Ballroom Dancing, Ode to Koala Bear. I think it was Keep Undercover and Rain Clouds.
Average too. Working out with Wings at the time.
Right.
Wings was where they were rehearsing all those numbers, so those were still, when they were still in the picture there a little bit.
Yeah. Right. So, but getting back to the timeline, right around that same time as, they're working on the, We All Stand Together sessions. Paul's also holding rehearsals for the next Wings album. And that's when we were just talking about, Paul using George as, someone to pass the buck, as you say. And I think that was Lawrence Juber who you quoted on that in the book. And, but do you think you think it was fair for Paul to do that, or should he been a little bit more upfront, saying, look, this is the way it's going to be. I'm just done with the band.
Yeah, but we have history that shows us he was never great at that. We see that over and over throughout his career. You sort of have to quit Paul. And if you don't quit Paul, he will quit you through somebody else, right?
Right.
And
that's Pete Best how that worked out.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's exactly right, Andy. I mean, that's the prototypical example. I look back not at the Japanese tour that didn't happen, but perhaps more usefully at Back to the Egg, which is right up there with Tug of War for me, by the way, and I know you love it too. I adore that record. Great guitar sound. The fact that he had, of course, many of those McCartney 2 songs already in production by that point. Just a lot of great work there. And then to see, after he gets this big deal from Columbia, that it only is number 9 or number 7.
Right.
even with the several great songs on that record, was dispiriting for him. And I think at that point, after London Town, which was, I love London Town as a Beatles fan, but it's not as good as Back to the Egg. Paul was able to make those comparisons, and I think that must have been dispiriting for him.
Right.
At a certain level.
Right. Does Back to the Egg do better with Good Night Tonight on it?
I think it does, because of course, trying to use the model the Beatles had in the 1960s, which was a very valuable one in the post-war world where income was limited in the UK, and not including the song on there was a very different thing. You know, by that point, you always had the hit single on the record, even if it was a year old, right? Much less a few months old. So it would have gotten them some more units and pushed it up a few more notches. But I think that performance really stuck in Paul's craw, I think it's safe to say.
Right.
He needed to make a change. And here comes George Martin. And you mentioned such a great example of that shift with ballroom dancing, right? The elements that George Martin brings to that aren't many, but when he does, he's just peppering it with magic here and there. And Paul wasn't creating that with Denny Lane and I don't mean any disrespect to those guys. They're a big part of my life, listening to the music of Wings. Some of my favorite moments in existence happened because of them. But it's not the same as the sort of history eclipsing work that you can get out of a guy named George Martin.
Right. I found it funny to believe how you're writing about how he had his own psychological challenges to deal with Paul, that being George Martin. Here he is, arguably the most successful producer in the history of music, and here he is having his own issues to deal with Paul. And you talk about how it had to be honesty, there had to be trust with Paul, and then who was George to tell Paul, what was a good song, So it was just, I still find it amazed how he had his own doubts about working with him instead of just going into this with just gleaming a confidence, with this project.
McCartney has always said something that I come back to, and George Martin must have known this implicitly. And that was, Paul would say, sometimes I just can't tell why Hey Jude, for example, is going to be this blockbuster, and how that's not necessarily of the same level. He would often, and has often, said that he's a little tone deaf about what a hit will be. And you can see that in our marvelous conversation a few years ago with Chris Thomas, where Paul just simply could not figure out what to put on Back to the Egg.
Yeah, I think he said something about how Bowie came to visit, and he said he liked a particular bass line, and then he changed it Paul changed it the next day or something like that. I mean,
there's a, it goes back to an artist being in many ways too close to his own work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Paul's a quintessential example of that, of someone who is so very close to his craft and always has new ideas brewing that there's just not enough space and time to get them all down.
Right.
Your description of those first few moments of Tug of War nails it. When you described Ode to a Koala Bear, Rain Clouds, all of these different songs showing up. He's just so fecund all the time that he's producing new ideas. And that's why, even today, he's if he's not working on a song, he's painting something.
Right.
That's true. And I learned this years ago from some curators from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame who were talking about trying to do exhibits with him, and just how difficult it was because he's so forward thinking. He's not very good at doing the backcast work. I mean, we all heard it 2 years ago when he said that was the first time he'd listened to the White Album in like 30, 40 years.
Wow, right.
Because he is looking in a forward way. Now, George Martin did that too, but he did it in a more critical sense. And Paul needed somebody to be critical of him.
Gotcha. Can you talk a little bit about Air Studios in London specifically? You know, what made that such a sought after recording studio at that time?
Well, Air Oxford Street, of course, which closes down not long after this, frankly, for no other reason than the rent was ridiculous.
Mm.
No, it was just it was a great facility. It was sought after for the simple reason that it was highly convenient.
Mm.
I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I've talked to a lot of folks who worked there, both behind the desk and as musicians. And, you know, if you were going through London, this was an easy place to get to. It wasn't, it was cheaper than road, you know, so you could roll in there and get a lot of work done.
Mm.
What part of London was it in, Ken, in relation to what section of London was it in?
Piccadilly.
Oh, it was in Piccadilly. Okay.
Yeah, it's not far from, I think, hopefully I'll see it again, but it's not very far from the Piccadilly Circus tube stop.
Right.
Yeah, it's, which meant, by the way, that it had to be, George sunk a lot of money into a studio they did not own.
Right. Yeah. So it was in another building. It wasn't its own building. They were renting out what floors?
Several floors, top floors, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a lot of studios, right in the heyday of New York City, right? You had the Hit Factory and the record plant. They were upper floors where you'd record because you needed to get away from the sounds of the street. But even still, you had to get world-class folks in there to provide the soundproofing so that you could create a good room, as they say.
Right. So, up on the wall and stuff. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and you know, George Martin hired a lot of the best consultants to wire up those studios, to gear them out, because he never pretended that he was, you know, a savant about no, he knew the right brands you wanted to have and the, you know, and what he was looking for, but he didn't pretend to have that knowledge. And that's a big difference with his son, whereas George, of course, had very strong musical training. Giles does know a lot about what kind of desk he wants to work with, et cetera, et cetera.
Gotcha. You know, moving forward now, and so the work begins now, officially begins on December 7th, 8th, it looks like. And like we said, they're knocking out Ballroom Dancing, Keep Undercover, Rain Clouds, Oh to a Koala Bear. Then unfortunately on the 9th, that's when they learn about their friend's death. You write about how, you know, Paul, George, and Jeff just, you know, spent most of that just they recalling memories of Lennon and a lot of tears.
Let me just interject real quick. That wasn't the first thing that they did, though, was they recorded We All Stand Together. It was done in hand, right? Or not? Was it not? Was We All Stand Together? It was already, well, obviously it came out in '84, but wasn't it?
I love that song, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the version I had.
Right. You know?
Like an idiot, I played it.
But I've always been very curious with that. Like, it was the first thing they collaborated on when they got back together in '80.
And the last thing released.
And the last thing that comes out in '84. I've always been. You got it, Ken?
Yeah. No, I had to turn on the lights.
Okay. Your copy. But I've always been perplexed by that. I've always been perplexed by that. It was the first thing done, and it came out in '84 as a little precursor to the Broad Street film. I was always curious why that was, if you knew.
I can't explain any of that timing.
Yeah.
I'm curious with all of, because so much of that music was recorded in advance. Damn near all of Pipes of Peace was completed.
Right. Yeah.
It was just coming out to us in sort of slow motion in the '80s.
Right.
We're at the mercy of their release schedule. Whereas now, they would be getting us that product as quickly as they can, so we would buy it.
Yeah, I didn't learn until some time ago that it actually did go back to 1980. I'd always assumed it was just right in the middle of the tug of war sessions, Pipes of Peace. They just did this, but it was already long in the can by then.
Right.
So it I was always amused to read that.
I think that was almost kind of like the let's see how we're going to work together, type thing before we move into an album. I think that's like almost like the perfect song for those two to collaborate on. I mean, just with all of the different instrumentation, and the choir, the boys, singing in there, getting in there. Or was that with Pipes of Peace? I'm sorry, but
this was
yeah.
The Finchley Frogettes with the
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's like a perfect song for those two to work on together.
Yeah,
and it provides numerous memorable touches to so much of the music, right?
Right.
Subtle touches of orchestration through all 3 or 4 of those projects, if we count them separately. He adds a lot
Absolutely
to them.
Right.
Sometimes I would argue that Paul's material's not up to snuff, particularly the further we get away from Tug of War. But I think he's still running scared from the what he probably saw as a fiasco with Back to the Egg.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, he's owning the charts, and
right.
The lower part of the top 10's got to look pretty bad to him.
Absolutely.
Which to anybody else would be like, hey, that's great, but for Paul McCartney, that was not.
Oh, absolutely. And think back, when I talk to students about periods in music history, the 70s are one of the most competitive times. You have so many incredible acts, including, frankly, disco stalwarts who are fighting, especially as the years go on toward 1980 for our attention. They're all coming in the wake of the Beatles. They've been influenced by the greatest band in the universe. And and here they are really putting out a lot of great music. So for Paul to come up at 7 or 9 or however it did in the United States, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. That's amazing. I mean, 79 has a lot of amazing records coming out. He came out the same week as the Cars with Candy O,
right?
One of the most anticipated releases because of their first album.
Breakfast in America, Supertramp.
I think only in the 70s can you have Peter Frampton sell 30 million copies of his live album, and then his next album only sell 7 or 10, and it's considered a flop.
Right, and it wasn't that bad a record. Quite frankly, I'm You, right? And
I'm In You, yeah.
I'm In. That's right. And it's a fine record, but you'd think the anticipation alone would ensure a certain level of success. Even Fleetwood Mac sees that.
Yes,
Tusk. With Tusk.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, but getting back to the Lennon death thing, so that puts a halt on the project for about a week. But man, to be a fly on the wall with Emmerich and George Martin and Paul McCartney, letting it all out and remembering all these great memories of John must have really been something special.
Sure. And I think probably equally or maybe more powerfully would have been when they hook up with George to work all those years ago.
Yeah, we'll bring that up in a second too. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that must have been. We've recently begun to see the pictures that Linda took that day. And it's it's hard to look at some of that.
Right. It sure is. You write that George Martin was angry about the murder. Here he is, just a year prior, you said they meet and maybe their friendship is starting to rekindle again, and then all of a sudden it's just taken away from him.
It is, and you can see it on YouTube. There's a clip of him on the evening news in London.
The next day, right?
Yeah, it is hard to watch.
I'll have to write that down.
Yeah, of the two that I think of when I think of those just terrible days are that it's not that long, but he's on the evening news in London, and it's tough to watch. And then the other one is Jack Douglas.
Jack Douglas's interview from the same night, heartbreaking.
It was Good Morning America, I think he was on the next day. Yeah, and that's just
that's another one where you could just tell that he is just absolutely just shocked, and I'm sure we've all seen plenty of Jack Douglas interviews before. If you haven't seen that one, Tom, check that one out too.
Yeah, definitely will. Definitely
It's
will.
not even 12 hours since John was murdered, and
Right.
it was with
Right.
Tom Snyder. Yeah.
Right, the Tom Snyder show. Right,
Yeah.
right. Which I think was at night. I think.
No. Yeah, they ran it at night, but
it was shot during the day, in the morning.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
Show that Lennon actually was on some years prior too.
1975. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So speaking of,
John,
how. Well, go ahead.
John had watched Paul on the Tomorrow Show in December 1979.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of, how George handles, his emotions and his comments, you get a complete odd comment from Paul. It's a drag in it, from Paul, which, I don't, some people handle it differently. I mean, I know I don't know what I would have said if, my best friend since 1957 just, was just murdered.
We need to look at the context of the time, running out of a studio into a cab, and he was not in the mood to talk to anybody. And anybody to think it was a flippant remark is just not looking at it the right way, in my opinion.
No, I agree with you, Andy. And I've had to write about it a couple of times because it's a matter of fact that it happens, and people did think it was flippant, but I've never read it that way. I mean, how do you talk about that? You never recover.
Let alone as you're walking out of the studio into a cab and you know that there's going to be people waiting for you to talk about it and you don't want to deal with it. So he just said, screw it, I'm going to say this. And then, of course, the media, even in its wisdom back then, twisted it and made it a lot worse than it was. I think time has been kinder to him with that incident. I think people realize now that that's but back then it was.
And we also know that it was a drag.
Yeah.
Yeah, very true. Very true. So,
if you guys noticed, I'm sure you have, that when George Harrison dies, he was really careful.
Yeah.
Remember, they caught him outside of his estate, and he said he was my baby brother.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, he walked out and did the whole thing. Right.
Yeah. So, if only if he did that for John, he was my older brother, and all this. So February of '81, they get back to work on the tug of war, but this time they pack up the bags, they head over to Montserrat, like you said, talked about earlier. That was the island that was owned by the British. Is that correct?
I believe so. It's a principality.
Right.
Of course, now the studio's in the forbidden zone.
So he took the time and care for that studio like he did at the one in Oxford, or here in the UK as well, correct? By setting that up.
I would argue it was better.
Okay.
Quite frankly, I mean, it was more state of the art. If there's such a thing, I guess there is such a thing. It was brand new.
Right.
George spared no expense. So Paul was there. He probably could have still smelled the fresh paint at that point.
I'm sure he was the first one to check it out.
Yeah. And of course, they rolled in all of these stellar musicians. Paul had folks playing with him.
Absolutely. So, the George Harrison visit, like you mentioned earlier, mainly, I mean, they went there to possibly get a solo for Wanderlust. I want to get your feelings on that for a second, but for the record, I mean, George Martin really didn't have anything to do with the song per se, right? I mean, he really didn't, did he do anything on the song itself all those years ago?
No, it was already completed.
Okay.
Remember, George Harrison had recorded the whole damn thing, and Ringo was going to do the vocal, but didn't like how he didn't like the range.
Okay.
They were all working on new music for Ringo. John had written 3 songs for him.
Can't Fight Lightning.
Yeah, and he had given them to him, which was a great title.
Mm-hmm.
And he had given them to him in November 1980. The demos, and Paul had written, I don't recall what his contributions were.
Was it Private Property?
Attention.
And attention, yeah.
Okay, and then you know, George was doing the same thing.
Right.
In fact, he had just seen George when he saw John at the Plaza Hotel in
Mm-hmm.
November 1980. So you know, Ringo had sort of scrapped this, and George had written it, had tailored the lyrics toward, you
Right.
know, a memorial.
So, Wanderlust, guitar solo, yes or no?
That George Harrison was going to play.
Yeah, I mean, would you have liked to have seen a solo on that song?
Oh, I think it would have been a lot of fun, and it, you know, perhaps would have helped their relationship to a certain extent. That you may know better than I do. Did George actually record a solo, or they were just
See,
throwing?
no. From my understanding was they worked on all those years ago, and then George deemed the song not worthy of a solo. He pretty much liked it as it was, or as is.
Yeah.
You know. So
I don't think it needs a solo. I think
no.
the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble's perfect for that.
I agree.
Yeah. You know, I love what it's right next to The Pound is Sinking. I love those two songs.
Back to back.
Yeah, I think they're great. And we didn't need another Ballroom Dancing, and we didn't need another Wanderlust.
No. I don't think a guitar solo would have been needed there, but I mean, it would have been cool if it had happened, but you know.
Right. So correct me if I'm wrong. You know, Tug of War was George Martin's most successful album since Abbey Road, wouldn't you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because I don't think he had a #1 album with any of the acts that he produced in the 70s.
You know, now that you say it, that strikes me as being true. But now I want to go back and check.
Yeah, because I mean, we know that Ventura Highway was a #1 song.
He didn't record that. That was with
he didn't.
Right. So what had happened with America is they had their breakout record, which was a smash. Their second record, though, really tanked.
Mm-hmm.
And they were lifelong Beatles fans, like anybody, you know, with taste. And and they brought in George, and he brought them right back with Sister Golden Hair.
Mm-hmm.
And what, Tin Man?
Tin Man, yeah.
Did he produce I Need You as well, too, Ken, or no?
I don't think he did that one.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
But anyway, but you know, here's the point. So that's when they felt like, or their record company felt like it was time for greatest hits. And George remastered and remixed everything that went on that. I'm talking about their greatest hits album.
Yes.
The cartoon-like.
Yes.
White. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was George who went back and put his touch on the mixes.
Right. Yeah, because I don't think the Beck album, I don't think went to #1. The Jimmy Webb album, I don't think, you know, went to #1. That wouldn't have gone to number. You know, you said that Cheap Trick album didn't do as well as they were hoping.
No, barely made the top 20.
Right. So
yeah. So that's George Martin's great return. But he, you know, by his own admission, he had trouble choosing acts.
Okay.
He really did. He happened to work really, really well with this one in particular. And you probably recall this from the first volume of the biography. He used to get a little chagrined when Brian Epstein would say he had the magic touch, and anything he touched turned to gold. And George Martin would say privately, "That's just not true." I work pretty well with these guys.
Right.
Not everything I do is of this caliber.
Right. He wanted nothing to do with This Is Your Life, right?
Yeah, he didn't want to do that, but that his wife kind of.
Yeah, kind of gave him the elbow, get in there. Yeah, that was a fun story. I enjoyed reading that. You know, having a lot of his past clients or musicians that he worked with in the past showing up. So I thought that was pretty cool. One thing I really respect about George Martin is he's brutally honest with himself. He talks about, or you write about him wanting to play the oboe, and instead of getting professional, which he considered himself a professional oboist, and he didn't really care for what he played, and he realized that it was ghastly, I think was the quote. And then what he ended up doing was just ended up playing the notes on the keyboard.
Well, and of course he sold his oboe to pay for his down payment on his first house.
That's
What a
right.
world when you can do that.
Right. Back then, when an oboe can help make a down payment on a house, that's
Ken, somewhat related. Are you in the camp of George Martin just happened to just, sign the Beatles, or do you believe, like Lewison, that it was a whole, he was told to sign them?
because of the affair with
Right.
his now or
Oh no, Mark's absolutely correct about that. I don't know that it was as go sign them. I think it was just what are you thinking, dude? We got to keep this guy Brian Epstein happy. He's the biggest record retailer in the North. This contract is not worth the price of the paper it's printed on. No Northern act is going to sell 1 million copies, and even if they do, we're going to give them like $500. Who cares? Studio time's paid for. What are you thinking? And of course, what George Martin was thinking is, why do I want to associate myself with backwater guys? He spent his entire adult life trying to become posh. You don't get more posh or posher by hanging out with guys from Liverpool, which is the dregs, right?
Sure.
I mean, you just don't do it. And he had no interest in that. And in fact, Brian had turned him off the minute he walked in and said, "I'm representing a band from Liverpool." And George thought, "You're an idiot." And then he said, "They're going to be bigger than Elvis." And it was the one time somebody was right. But so I'm in the camp that he didn't actually, he didn't audition them. Yeah, they were foisted on him. But I think, again, like the story of Get Back, which becomes an amazing story at the end of the month in January 1969, the story of George Martin, the Beatles, is better. I told this to Mark when his book came out. We were talking about it, and he told me he'd gotten some grief over it. And I said, yeah, but they shouldn't be grieving over this. This version's better. Because it meant they had to win George Martin over, and they do. When they go back and they take Please Please Me, they speed it up and they do what he told them to do. And they come back and they've recorded what he thinks is going to be a #1 song. They won him over. They did it the right way. They earned, that was their audition.
Right.
They went back to Liverpool and they perfected that song. I love the detail that Mark Lewison was able to dig out of that session when they came back and made the recording. Because we'd all known for years because George Martin had said it many times, when he presses the talk back and says, "Gentlemen, you've just recorded your first #1 record."
Right.
Mark, and this is one of the things that makes him so great, who found out what they did afterwards. And that was, they went on the floor laughing. It was absurd. What is this old guy, 36-year-old man? What is wrong with him? We're not going to have a #1 song. I mean, it was what they wanted more than anything in the world, but they weren't going to delude themselves into believing that was going to happen.
Right. Interesting. Your thoughts on the song "Pipes of Peace"?
I adore the song. I think there are a lot of weak moments on that record. Side 2 is very hard for me to listen to. But you know what? Keep Undercover's a lot of fun, and I like So Bad.
So Bad's great.
Other songs. And in fact, I like a lot of side 1 on that record. But I like Pipes of Peace a lot. I love the introductory sounds that they created in the studio. That kind of ambient, the electronic noise that they fashion. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, you wrote that you felt that at 36, I think that Paul was losing the vocal dexterity that he enjoyed for most of his singing career. I mean, how do you consider that album as him as a singer? I mean, do you think he still has the vocal chops on like Tug of War in this period, or do you believe that he was losing that vocal ability he had?
You probably remember from when we spoke to Chris Thomas. Chris said that Paul was speaking very plainly about how he didn't feel he had the vocal strength back in Making Abbey Road when they were doing Oh Darling.
Right.
Which is
Well, how many takes did that take?
yeah, but so
I think
Paul
that
was
yeah, I think that scream at the end of The Pound is Sinking is like one of the last great
Oh,
screams.
Rinse the Raindrops. Rinse the Raindrops. That scream at the end of that song,
Yeah.
probably his last great scream.
Look, Paul is from 1966 to right around 82,
Yeah.
is the finest singer in the history of rock music. I mean, he has 5 or 6 different looks that he can pull off on his voice. He's got the Elvis voice, the screaming voice, you know, who can complain about the incredible sweet quality he was able to get? And even, you know, obviously his later years have been somewhat spotty when you compare them to the incredible legacy that he had already produced. But even, you know, songs like Distractions. I love listening to that because he's got this smoky quality to his voice that didn't exist before. You know, or some of Kisses on the Bottom, I hear some interesting tonalities that he gets just because he's older.
Right.
You know, so when someone has a voice that's as beautiful as the one that was singing on Wings Over America, right?
Right.
When you listen to that record, he is just at the top of his game for that tour.
Right.
Really remarkable. Not the best performances necessarily of his career, but there are moments throughout that production where you can just hear him going to some pretty rare heights.
Gotcha. Was his hearing an issue at all during this period? George Martin's?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay.
George had been slowly losing his hearing for a long time.
Right.
It doesn't get debilitating really until the 90s, I believe. But even in the late 80s, he would start to complain about it. But in the 90s, he was very sure about what was happening. And I wrote to him when I started working in 2014 on George Martin and the books, and his folks said, George just, you know, he can't hear anything. There's just no point.
Yeah. So you started working on the book in 2014. I believe in 2012 is when the Produced by George Martin comes out. I mean, obviously you had to have seen it, and you know, what was your take on that documentary?
You know, it's it's like a lot of productions associated with the Beatles and their circle. There are moments of, you know, revisionism. You know, we see that in the anthology too.
Right.
But having said that, I was able to mine several moments out of it that I thought were marvelous. Isn't that the one where he talks about painting and compares his work to Degas? I thought that was excellent. I love the moment. I mean, the whole thing's worth it just to watch him broach the subject of the fact that he is a very competitive person, and Giles is like, no joke. You know, both of his sons told me that he was very competitive with everybody, including, you know, he was
after this 80s collaboration. I'm checking, correct me if I'm wrong, the only things he collaborated on was Come On People and Beautiful Night in the 90s for Paul. Is that was there more?
I think that's correct.
Yeah. It was only but that was the last, this period here, other than just 2 songs, that was pretty much it. This was the intense period here. And then going into Broad Street, do you think like it was a case of, well, he produced Tug of War, he produced Pipes of Peace, let me just bring him on for the film kind of thing?
You know, I don't know. I think George was kind of his guy at that point. But then Paul, being Paul, was thirsty for different collaborations and went off with who was it? Stewart, right?
Yeah, Eric Stewart.
Eric Stewart, and began working on Press to Play.
Right.
You know, that's Paul.
That's Paul. You write that he really enjoyed the remake of Long and Winding Road and Silly Love Songs, which is
yeah, he did. I don't.
I don't either. The saxophone doesn't do it for me.
No, I disagree with him on both counts. But yeah, George liked working on those songs. You know, it's a pale version of the original Silly Love Songs, you know, which didn't need to be remade.
Right.
I
do
think
we know?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'll say just I'm sure if Ken has seen this, and I'm curious what you guys think about it. One of my favorite moments that kind of encapsulates this whole 80 to 84 period and the relationship between the two of them is the South Bank special on the documentary of the making of the album and the film, where the two of them were just playing George is on the piano, Paul's on the bass, and they're just doing the riff to No More Lonely Nights over and over and over again. That's, I think, a wonderful moment in time that kind of encapsulates what that relationship was for this moment in time.
Yeah, that's a nice image. I like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Right. Do we know how Toto got involved with some of these recordings?
You know, I was so limited for space at that point. I didn't run down some of those. You know, Paul was always thirsty, particularly in this period, to start working with other musicians. Again, maybe I'm over dramatizing this, but I feel like somewhere back there, Linda's pushing him to bring in new talent.
You're right. Yeah, I gotcha.
Which song are they on, Tom? The Silly Love Songs, right?
Yeah, the Silly Love Songs. I think they made their way onto a couple other tracks for the soundtrack.
Right.
You know, but the one that I found interesting was for Silly Love Songs. Yeah, but was it always your? Did you always planned it to be a 2-part book? This George Martin biography?
No, it's going to be 1 part. But I had beta tested it with a couple of people, and they said no. People are going to like the deep dive. It was going to be 3 parts.
Yeah.
And and that's why I got dinged a little in a couple of reviews on this. The last section kind of goes a little faster than I might have wanted it.
Okay.
I wanted to have volume 2 go right up to them kind of shunting him aside at the beginning of January 1969.
Okay.
And volume 3 would have been Swan Songs.
Okay.
So I would have been able to go a little deeper into the solo years. I had to leave some things on the cutting room floor with and other folks like that, but that's fine.
Yeah. Well, maybe one day you can do a Stephen King Stan version, and you know, doing an extended.
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No, because when the editor at the press that did those books said, you know, no, we got to go with 2 and not 3. After I spent a week, by the way, creating spreadsheets for him, detailing how I was going to get a 3rd volume out of all of this solo material and the end of the Beatles. After I finished volume 2, I had this great moment of relief. So, which probably tells me I didn't need to be writing a 3rd volume.
Yeah. What are some of your favorites tracks from the duo from this time?
Somebody Who Cares.
Nice.
I love that recording. That's a great headphone song. You know,
right.
Listen to you can hear the fingers on the acoustic guitar. You know, the glissando from Ballroom Dancing, which we've talked about before. You know, it's just a moment of brilliance from George Martin.
Right.
I like Tug of War a lot of passion. Obviously, his ode to John Lennon is moving. I like Dress Me Up as a Robber. You know,
That's interesting.
There's so many wonderful songs from that period, you know, that you can't look away from.
Yeah, there's so many great singing styles throughout that period. You know, with the falsetto for, you know, Dress Me Up as like a Robber. You know, it's just
So bad, just like So Bad also.
Yeah, So Bad, and the smooth vocals throughout Wanderlust and No More Lonely Nights. Amazing. You know, the Pipes of Peace, I think it was very well sung. But
they make a lot of great musical choices too.
Right.
Gilmore for the guitar solo.
Oh yeah.
You know,
probably the first or second best decision they made during those recordings for sure.
Yeah.
You know, Andy, what are some of your favorites from that time?
Wanderlust for sure. I love the counter melody in that song, especially towards the end. Wanderlust, Take It Away.
Yeah.
I love Ebony and Ivory. You know, Pipes of Peace. I even like Hey Hey on Pipes of Peace. I do. It's. I know it's not Ken's favorite side of the album, but I enjoyed it. But obviously, Tug of War was the high watermark of that relationship. I think everybody can agree to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what I find curious, I always was wondering who was the rationale behind this decision to re-record some of those Tug of War tracks for the film. And
I think that's Paul. I think that's McCartney. And every time I think about Give My Regards to Broad Street, I think about John Lennon in 1967 saying, "We're not directors." And it's there's a life lesson in there that I sometimes talk about with my students when we discuss Magical Mystery Tour. And they'll watch it and they'll say, "How come the music is one of the best albums?" Because everybody loves that, compilation. And yet the film is goofy. And it's a good reminder that when you find something you're really good at, work on that, work on that craft, because what you're doing is not necessarily portable to every other genre on earth.
Right.
Well, if you're curious, here's a little review off the back of the VHS from 20th Century Fox. A fanciful musical feature, thoroughly entertains. McCartney possesses a captivating screen persona, a solid piece of entertainment. The Hollywood Reporter.
Well, you get what you pay for, right?
That's right.
I remember seeing that vividly the weekend it came out. My brother and I went across northern part of Houston to this place. I think it still exists, the Greenspoint Mall, and went to the movies there to see it as soon as we could. And there was one other person in it. And that person left. And, on the way back, we were just like, well, what was that?
Oh, man.
Incoherent.
So just to sum up the success of these, of the work they did together, you got Ebony and Ivory #1 here and in the UK. The album Tug of War was #1 here and in the UK. Take It Away single was #10 here, 15 in the UK. Say 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 was #1 here, #2 in the UK. Pipes of Peace was #1 in the UK. So Bad was #23 here. No More Lonely Nights was #6 here and #2 in the UK. And We All Stand Together was #3 in the UK. So that's
the winner of the Ivor Novello Award too.
Correct. Yeah.
And I remember vividly watching No More Lonely Nights on the charts. That thing should have been #1 in the US.
Oh, easy. Yeah, absolutely.
But again, to provide context for this, the competition was incredible.
Right.
That Paul was facing. You had all sorts of new 80s bands rolling along by then who were burning it up. Paul's sound suddenly didn't sound like a lot of the electronica that was emerging and with which folks were being really successful. So those are incredible numbers by anyone, anytime, but especially in that period where you've got so many great legacy acts that are out and working.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, yeah, I mean, we can sit here all day and say, yeah, this song should have been a #1, that song should have #1, but you have to look, like you said, at the competition that was out there at the time, and not a lot of people were competing with the Madonnas and the Princes and the Genesis.
The Police,
right.
especially the Police, very big at that time.
Yeah,
Rush.
Rush. Yeah,
go on all day about the competition that's out there. It was enormous.
And at this time, I mean, Paul was about 42 around this time, right? 41, 42,
right?
Around 80. So I mean, he's considered old at this time, compared to the people in there who are 25, 23, and he's still, the fact that he still did have a top 10 single, as much as he wanted it to be #1, it's pretty good.
And remember, crucially, he was not touring behind these works.
Right, that's true.
By this point, there was a very built-in expectation that you would at least do 20 dates. Fleetwood Mac did dates behind their albums.
Yeah.
You would tour a record.
Yeah,
and
Stones.
Paul wasn't doing that.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Dare I say, I mean, if the movie was a little bit better, maybe No More Lonely Nights would have done, better here. Who knows?
Plenty of TV exposure and appearances on TV shows, but no,
right.
nothing live on the tour at all.
Right, and he got lots of play on MTV, the video.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the things I love about the McCartney years DVD set, is we got all these wonderful videos and they're complete. They got the beginning when he was in the projector room, and, playing around with the cat. I mean, that's great.
And
great
that
stuff.
That bass riff.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. What do you remember about the first thing you ever wrote, Beatles related?
Oh, I wrote. No one's ever asked me that. The first thing I wrote was in junior high school for the fantastic newspaper, the Kingwood Cougar. And I was editor of the paper, and I was told I had to write a story and stop just editing. So I wrote a piece on Paul is Dead.
No kidding.
Yeah, because, that seems pretty fascinating when you're 12 or whatever.
Right. You didn't happen to have this baby with you when you were writing?
I did not, no. No, I wrote it completely. I was probably using the Nicholas Schaffner book or something.
Okay.
There you go.
Gotcha.
My resource. But I remember that to set the paper, you had to actually take it and stencil out each word so that it would then be set in type.
Painstaking
What about
process.
Yeah? What about professionally? What was the first thing you wrote about the Beatles professionally?
When I was on the tenure track back at Penn State, I wanted to write about the Beatles, but I knew because if you don't publish, you perish. I did not want to perish. And there was a journal I wanted to publish in that was pretty tough to get into, so it would look good on the tenure track, and that was called Text. And so I wrote a piece about the discrepant release of the Beatles' American and UK releases, and I applied textual theory to that.
Okay. Cool. Very cool. There was a question I like to ask guests. I didn't get to ask you. I don't think I got to ask you last time you were on with Kid O'Toole. And if I did ask you, just let me. If you remember me asking me, just let me know. And it's a question I like to ask guests that are in the know of the solo careers. Especially John and Paul. And that we'll set this in the first 5 years of their solo careers. And who do you think missed who more in their solo career? Do you think John missed Paul more in his solo career or vice versa?
Well, the first 5 years, I think Paul's missing John more.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Although they both have, moments that are really forgettable. Don't tell Ken Michaels I said that.
Okay.
But they both have some really ineffectual moments. I think Paul is needing to get a little edgier than he was. But, John needed Paul. It was a wonderful story that a guy who was in the Village where George Martin died, up where his estate is where Dame Judy still lives today. And one of the local townspeople was asking George about what the roles were in the relationship with the band. And it was such a marvelous little story. I don't know if I included it. But the fellow said, so what was Paul's job? And he said, well, Paul, everybody needs a Paul. And he said, why you need a Paul? Great musician, great songwriter, all that aside, you need a Paul because Paul was the convener. Seriously, he said Paul was the convener. Paul was the guy who would say, hey, let's get back in the studio.
Right.
You got to and you can see him doing this with John several times. Are you going to bring some new songs? We need to bring some new material forth. And he compared Paul to this guy in the Village, some delivery guy or something like that. He's a convener. He shows up. He's like Paul. Paul's the guy who shows up. And I think John needed Paul very desperately in the 70s, particularly in the latter part, because he had lots of ideas. Some of them were exceptional, but he needed someone to take him to the studio and say, it's time's up.
Right, we're gonna do this. And everybody
needs a convener.
Right.
It's very true because if you don't have those folks in your midst, things won't happen. You know, we'll all think you'll never write that novel,
Right.
right? You'll never do that thing because you're waiting for the convener. We need deadlines. We need that. And I think Paul, you know, even though he would have some weaker moments and throughout his career, particularly in the post-Beatles years, he still showed up. He still probably went in too much.
Right.
but the point is, John needed a convener. And in my John Lennon book, what I really discovered, one of the great discoveries, was how much Yoko became that person and forced her. You know, she didn't have that kind of personality, but she made herself do it. She bought him new recording equipment and a new keyboard in, I think it was December 1978. And because she knew he was getting depressed. He's got to do something, make some demos, you know.
Right.
She probably didn't say it as expressly as that, but she did that. And then Roger Farrington, the guy who took John and went with John and Yoko to the Hit Factory on the first day, August 6th or 7th, 1980. He said Yoko had clearly pushed for this, but was nervous. And he said she was nervous as they walked out and got in the car, and he took the photos, and Paul Gorish is there taking the photo of them coming out of the archway. But he said that she was just nervous as hell because she realized that now the chips are down. She's been pushing him to do this. She knows he has some world-class material. But now she realizes that all it will take is one little thing to go wrong, and he's going to run back up to that bedroom.
Gotcha. Wow. And that was going to be my, my next question was talking about this new project, the John Lennon 1980. Is this finished? Is it ready to go? I mean, are you still tweaking it a little bit? I know we got a release date of October of this year for that. It's complete.
Ready to go. We are working on permissions with the photographs. That's getting wrapped up right now. We're working on a deluxe edition that will also come out, and we'll have maps and other kinds of cool period stuff that will go along with it. But yeah, it's been done for 3 or 4 months.
Okay, cool. And then now you've got a couple clones going back in time, or just working on other future projects, I'm sure, because it seems like you've got one after another coming out here.
Yeah, I don't need a convener.
Right, you do not.
Yeah, but I really wanted to tell this story so badly because it is a tragedy, but until you get to the tragedy, it is the great comeback story.
Right.
It is a guy lifting himself off the deck.
Right.
And fighting back every impulse to, like I said, go back up to that bedroom and shut the door. And the effort it took for him to get into that studio and to work again, and then the joy that he got out of it is something to behold. And I really just adored spending time with him. And feeling like I was right alongside him. And then I'm very proud of how I dealt with what obviously happens at the end, because he's no longer conscious for that story. So I tell it, and as you'll see, what I think is a unique way.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I can't wait. When does it come out again, Ken?
October.
We'll have it by September, I believe.
Okay.
We should at least have the electronic version. I don't know about this deluxe edition and when we'll see that, but there are a lot of really cool parts that we're putting together, like maps of New York at the time, because it's very much about the city too. He very subconsciously chose to live there and work there, and
were you able to talk to anybody that you were hoping to, that helped you out considerably for this
I was
project?
able to talk to anybody, but obviously I think Yoko said what she's going to say on the matter, and but I was telling it from his point of view too, so I had to be very careful. Sometimes I'd want to go too far into her story at the time, and I'd pull back because that was out of his purview. He's the one who's hanging out with Fred up in in Long Island. He's the one who goes to South Africa, to Bermuda. you know, so I had to make sure I stayed inside that lens.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
And kept the lens pretty narrow.
Cool. So, anything else you want to plug? Anything else in the works? Are you going to be appearing anywhere? Obviously, you're not going to be appearing anywhere. So,
Actually,
virtually, maybe.
Virtually, I will be at the 92nd Street Y a week from Friday. We're doing my Abbey Road show.
Okay.
With my pal Scott Fryman. We've done 2 or 3 of these where we have a little fun.
Cool.
We're going to do that. We were originally going to do it in person, but obviously we've been to a virtual scenario. So that's my next big thing to prepare for.
Okay.
Is that the same one that we saw? I saw you in Newark, Ken. Is it the same one where you're doing Solid State?
Yes, it'll be very similar to that, although we don't have as much time, so we've been working on cutting it down.
Yeah, that was a great night. I got to go with my friends and.
Oh yeah, we had fun there. They have an event with me slated for the fall to do like an evening with, I don't know, maybe they want to talk about that Kingwood Cougar article or something.
And you don't have to tell us what it is, but is anything in the works after the London project?
Sure. God, what am I doing right now? What am I supposed to be doing right now? I'm doing a book that I need to start on, and it's called "Imagine: The True Story of the Greatest Peace Anthem."
Oh, well, cool. Awesome.
So I'm going to have to say some iconoclastic things in that because it's had a storied, strange compositional experience.
Well, awesome. Great. Well, this has been great discussion. We really appreciate you being here and taking the time. I'm sure you're, busy doing all sorts of things right now. So,
Well, I'm sheltering in place.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So before we go, Andy, anything for you to add?
Yeah, I was on actually 2 episodes of When They Was Fab podcast with Ed Chen, talking about actually the Double Fantasy Milk and Honey sessions. As we
my fellow Houstonian.
Yeah, so we discussed, we talked a lot about the session musicians that were in there, and had a good time with Ed, and he posted that a few weeks ago, so that was fun. Other than that, we've got some more guests lined up for 2 legs that Tom's been working on, and
yeah, can't wait. So so after this episode that we're doing with Kenneth Womack right now, we're going to have Chip Madinger and Mark Easter on to talk about part of the 8 Arms to Hold You book, and looking forward to that. So that should be
Chip was
a great time.
absolutely wonderful to me. There were a number of times where I found myself in a corner trying to solve some historical issue, and I would write Chip, and boom, he would solve it.
Well, Andy likes to keep the book next to him at all times, pretty much, right?
Never. It's arm's reach. I don't need 8 arms. I know I only need 1 arm to get it.
Yeah, I have them on PDFs, so I'm able to get there. And, his work is just essential. And I like to have a couple of reference works I'm proud of, but what he's done to give us, especially 8 Arms to Hold You, quite frankly, the Lennon book's wonderful, but 8 Arms to Hold You we simply wouldn't have that information and would never have the time to go and put it together, and we owe him a great debt.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So you can get a hold of us by email, twolegspodcast@gmail.com. You can check us out on our YouTube channel, 2 Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast. Please check that out. You can see all of our wonderful faces, and I really appreciate Ken for showing his face for this for this episode. So please check that out and subscribe to that. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at 2 Legs Podcast. And man, what a good time for the show right now, Andy. I really appreciate, and I want to thank you for all the hard work you've been doing for the show. It's great. We're getting a lot of great feedback, so I really appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Happy to be here, brother. Happy to be here, brother.
Cool. And once again, everybody, thank you for listening. We really appreciate you taking the time and checking the show out. So as always, everybody out there, have a great day and a beautiful night. So long.
Listening to Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast, hosted by Tom Hunyadi and Andy Nichols, with musical contributions by Dylan